Our lesson today is to be able to add integers. The key idea today is that when we're adding integers with the same sign, we will add the absolute values of the integers, then use the common sign. For example, if we take a look at the integer sum of 2 and 5. 2 is a positive integer, 5 is a positive integer, so we're adding integers of the same sign. I add the absolute value of 2 and 5, that's going to give us 7, and we keep the sign the same. If we're adding two negative integers, negative 2 and negative 5, I add their absolute values once again. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2, the absolute value of negative 5 is 5, 2 and 5 is 7, but I keep the sign the same, so because both integers were negative, the sum is going to be negative. So that's our first rule of adding integers, and we'll take a look at some examples using that rule. Alright? Here's another example of that. If I have negative 2 and negative 4, and I'm looking for the sum, the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. Let me jot that down. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2, plus the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. So I add those two together, and that's going to give me 6. But because these were both negatives, my sum has to be negative 6. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2, the absolute value of negative 4 is 4, but the sum's going to be negative 6. Alright, let's erase that. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. Alright, we have 3 examples here. Our first example says we want to find the sum of 7 and 13. Notice that both integers are positive. That's a positive 7, and we're adding a positive 13. And our rule says that when the signs are the same, we add their absolute values. Well, the absolute value of 7 is 7. The absolute value of 13 is 13. So I add their absolute values, and I get 20, and I keep the sign the same. So positive 20 would be the sum. If I'm adding two negative integers, once again the signs are the same. Negative is the sign for the 8, negative is the sign for the 5. We add their absolute values. So 8 plus 5 is 13, but we keep the sign the same. So negative 13 would be the sum of negative 8 and negative 5. All right, our next example. We have negative 20 and negative 15. Once again, the signs are the same, so we add their absolute values. It's going to give me 35, but I keep the sign the same. It's going to be negative, so negative 35 would be the sum of negative 20 and negative 15. All right, try some examples, a few more. Negative 3 and negative 2. The sum's going to be negative 5. We add their absolute values because the signs are the same. 3 and 2 is 5, and we keep the sign the same. So negative 5 would be the sum. Negative 26 and negative 17. I want to add their absolute values. So that's going to be 43, but we keep the sign the same. So negative 43 would be the sum of negative 26 and negative 17. Negative 5 and negative 7, we're adding integers, two integers whose sign is the same, so I add their absolute values. 5 and 7 is 12, but I keep the sign the same, negative 12. If I'm adding integers, whether they're both positive or both negative, I add their absolute values and the sign stays the same. Negative 10 and negative 4, if I add their absolute values, that's 14, and I keep the sign the same. So negative 14 would be the sum of negative 10 and negative 4. Negative 14 and negative 16. I'm adding two integers with the same sign. I add their absolute values. It's going to be 30, and I keep the sign the same. Negative 30 would be the sum. Two numbers that are the same distance from 0, but on opposite sides of 0 are called opposites. For example, negative 3 and 3 are opposites. Right? So we're going to use our next rule for adding integers when we're adding integers with different signs, meaning one's positive, one's negative. We want to subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value, then use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. For example, if you have positive 8 and negative 10, I want to subtract the absolute values. 10 minus 8 is 2, but I take the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. Negative 10 has a greater absolute value, so because we have more negative than we do positive, the sum's going to be negative. If I look at another example, negative 13 and 17, I'm adding opposite signs here, a negative number and a positive number. I want to subtract their absolute values, so 17 minus 13 is 4, but I take the sign of the higher absolute value number. 17 has a higher absolute value than negative 13, so the sum's going to be positive. The additive inverse property says that the sum of an integer and its opposite are 0. So we're going to be using that additive inverse property when we do some of this addition with opposite signs. All right, so let's try some examples. We have 5 and negative 10. I subtract their absolute values because these are opposite signs, right? I have to determine first when I'm adding integers whether the signs are the same or the signs are opposites. Here the signs are opposite, so I subtract. That's going to give me 5. But I take the sign of the higher absolute value number, so negative 5 would be the sum of 5 and negative 10. I have negative 3 and 7. Once again, I have to recognize that I'm adding integers that have opposite signs. So I have to subtract their absolute values. 7 take away 3 is 4. And then I take the sign of the higher absolute value number. 7 has a higher absolute value than negative 3. So positive 4 would be the sum. I have negative 12 and 12. I'm adding integers with opposite signs. I subtract their absolute values, and that's going to be 0. And if you think about it, if you have 12 negative and then you add 12 positive, right, they're opposites. Anytime we add opposites, your sum's always going to be 0. All right, so let's mix it up a bit. Here we have opposite signs. I subtract. That's going to give me 2. But because I have more positive than negative, it's going to be positive 2 for my sum. Once again, adding opposite signs. So I subtract their absolute values. That's going to be 1. But I take the sign of the higher absolute value, so the sum is going to be negative because I have more negative than I do positive. All right. A couple more examples down here. We have 6 and negative 7. I'm adding integers with opposite signs, so I subtract their absolute values. That's going to give me 1. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. It's negative 1. Notice that when we're adding integers with opposite signs, we subtract first. All right? 19 and negative 15. I subtract first and that'll give me 4, and then I determine the sign of that 4. There are more positive than there are negative, so that's going to be positive 4 for my sum. Okay? Let's try a few more examples. Positive 7 and negative 7, they're opposites. That's going to be 0. We have negative 8 and 3. Once again, I'm adding opposites, so I subtract. That's going to give me 5, but I have more negative than I do positive. It's going to be negative 5 for the sum. Here I'm adding 3 integers. When we do addition, we have to do addition from left to right when we're adding more than 2 integers. So I start first with these 2 integers. Positive 2 and negative 15. Positive 2 and negative 15, I'm adding opposite signs, so I have to subtract their absolute values. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. But then I still have to add that negative 2. Right? That's my next step. Now I'm adding integers with the same sign, so I have to add their absolute values and then keep the sign the same, negative 15. Another way to look at that same problem is if you recognize that positive 2 and negative 2 are opposites, and you're adding opposites, right? They would zero each other out, and you're left with a negative 15. That would have been another way to look at the same problem if you recognize the 2 and the negative 2 were opposites. All right? Positive 10 and negative 12. You're adding integers with opposite signs, so I want to subtract their absolute values. That's going to be 2. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. It's going to be negative 2. Adding opposite signs once again, so we have to subtract their absolute values. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. There are more positive than there are negative, so positive 5 is going to be my sum. All right, here I could recognize that the negative 6 and positive 6 are going to be 0, so my answer is going to be negative 14. All right, but let's go from left to right. From left to right, I'm adding two integers with the same sign. That's going to be negative 20, but then I still have to add 6. And now I'm adding integers with opposite signs, so I have to subtract the 20 and the 6. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. Well, I have more negative than I do positive, so that would be negative 14. All right. Next example, if we're adding more than two integers, the list shows 4 bank account transactions in July. Find the change C in the account balance. In order to do that, we have to find the sum of the 4 transactions. So if we have a withdrawal, which is negative 40, then I'm adding $50 because that's a deposit. Then I have another deposit of 75, so we're adding that. And then we're taking away 50, so I'm adding a negative 50 to that amount. All right, let's go from left to right. Negative 40 and positive 50. I'm adding integers with opposite signs, so I have to subtract their absolute values. That's going to be 10. All right, take the sign of the higher absolute value number. There's more positive than negative, so that's going to be positive 10. I'm going to recopy the 75 and recopy the negative 50. Now I'm adding integers with the same sign. That's a positive 10 and a positive 75. That's going to be 85, but then we still have to add that negative 50. Now I'm adding integers with opposite signs, so I have to subtract 85 and 50. It's going to give me 35, and then take the sign of the higher absolute value number. There's more positive than there are negative, so $35 would be the account balance, the change, C. Okay, try a few more examples down here. Give us some room. Problem number 4, negative 2 plus 11. I'm adding integers with opposite signs, so I have to subtract their absolute values. That's going to be 9. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. Problem 5. We have a 9 and a negative 10. We're adding integers with opposite signs, so I have to subtract their absolute values. Take the sign of the higher absolute value number. So negative 1 would be the sum. Problem 6. We have negative 31, and I'm adding 31. Here I'm adding opposite signs, right? So I'm going to have to subtract their absolute values, right? And we're going to be 0. Anytime I'm adding opposites, I'm always going to be 0 here. All right? And I think that may be it, and that is it for our lesson today. Hopefully that was helpful, and we'll see you soon.